All right, so are you ready to really understand how the economy works? We're going deep today into macroeconomics using this grade guru summary someone sent in about demand management policies.
Yeah, demand management, it's a big one.
It is a big one. Basically, it's all about the tools that governments and central banks use to try to keep the economy stable,
Mm,
you know, growing at a healthy rate.
right, yeah, making sure inflation isn't out of control.
Exactly.
Keeping unemployment low, it's a delicate balancing act.
So it's like walking a tightrope.
In a way, yeah.
So to kick things off, let's talk about something called supply shocks. What happens when something unexpected throws the whole system off?
Well, a supply shock is basically you can think of it as a sudden disruption to the supply of goods and services in the economy.
Like what kinds of things?
A classic example is a sudden spike in oil prices, like what happened in the 70s.
Oh, right. Yeah, that caused a lot of problems
It did. When the price of oil goes up suddenly, it affects pretty much everything else.
because everything needs energy to be produced and transported.
Right. Exactly. So suddenly it costs more to make things, to ship things, and that increased cost gets passed along to consumers.
So prices go up on everything, groceries, gas, you name it.
Pretty much, yeah.
And that's where inflation comes in, right?
That's right. Inflation is basically a sustained increase in the general price level. When prices keep going up over time, that's inflation.
So a supply shock, like an oil price spike, can lead to inflation.
It absolutely can. And this can actually lead to a really tricky situation for policymakers, something called stagflation.
Stagflation. That sounds kind of ominous. What is it exactly?
It's a pretty nasty combination of high inflation, like we just talked about, along with high unemployment. It's a real dilemma because usually those two things don't happen at the same time.
Why is that?
Well, traditionally, when the economy is doing well, unemployment is low because businesses are hiring, but that strong demand can also push prices up, leading to inflation. And on the flip side, when the economy is weak, unemployment is high, but inflation tends to be low because there's not as much demand.
So stagflation is kind of a worst of both worlds situation.
You got it. And that's why it's so difficult for policymakers to deal with.
So how do they even begin to approach something like that? I mean, where do you even start?
Well, one way to think about it is to use a tool called the Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply Model, or ADS for short.
A model.
Right, it's basically a graph with two lines. One is the aggregate demand curve, or AD, which shows the total demand for goods and services in the economy at different price levels, and the other is the aggregate supply curve, or AS, which shows the total amount of goods and services that firms are willing to produce at different price levels.
Okay, I'm sort of visualizing this graph. So what do these lines look like?
The AD curve slopes downward, meaning that as prices go up, people demand less stuff.
Makes sense.
And the AS curve slopes upward. So as prices rise, firms are willing to produce more because they can make more profit.
So the point where these two lines intersect, that's like the sweet spot for the economy.
Exactly. That's the equilibrium point. It's where the amount that people want to buy matches the amount that firms want to produce. Let's call that point A on our graph.
All right, point A, got it. Now, how do those supply shocks we talked about earlier fit into this whole graph thing?
So let's say we get that oil price spike, that classic supply shock.
Yeah.
What happens is that it increases the cost of production for businesses.
Right, that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. So because it costs more to produce things, firms are willing to supply less at any given price level.
So what does that do to our graph?
It shifts the AS curve to the left. Let's call this new equilibrium point B.
Okay, so we went from point A to point B because the oil price shock.
Right, and point B represents a new equilibrium, but it's not a very good one. Because at point B, you've got higher prices and lower output.
What do you mean that means?
Well, lower output usually means fewer jobs and higher unemployment. So you've got that nasty combo of high inflation and high unemployment that we call stagflation.
Right, yikes. Okay, so the economy took a hit. What can policymakers do about this?
Well, that's where demand management policies come in. Our grade guru summary mentioned two main types, expansionary and contractionary. Think of them as like the gas pedal and the brake pedal for the economy.
I like that analogy. Okay, so expansionary is like hitting the gas.
Exactly. It's about trying to stimulate the economy and boost demand.
So how would they actually do that?
There are a couple of main ways. One is through fiscal policy, which involves changes in government spending and taxes.
So the government could increase spending on things like infrastructure projects,
Yeah.
building roads and bridges and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. That puts more money into the economy, creates jobs, and stimulates demand. The other way is through monetary policy, which is controlled by the central bank.
And what central banks do?
They control things like interest rates, so they could lower interest rates to make it cheaper for businesses to borrow money and invest.
Ah, I see. So both of those things would hopefully encourage more spending and economic activity.
That's the idea. And if it works, it would shift the AD curve to the right, back towards its original position.
So on our graph, we'd be moving away from that bad equilibrium point B.
Yep. Let's say it shifts to a new point, point C. At point C, output is higher and unemployment is hopefully lower.
So problem solved.
Well, not so fast. There's a trade-off. Remember, we're dealing with stagflation. So while expansionary policies might help with the unemployment part by boosting demand, that extra demand can also push prices up even further.
Ah, so it might actually worsen the inflation part of the problem.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act.
Okay, so expansionary policy is like hitting the gas. What about contractionary policy? Is that like hitting the brakes?
You got it. Contractionary policy is about trying to slow down the economy, typically to combat inflation.
So in this case, the government might decrease spending or the central bank might raise interest rates.
Precisely. That makes it more expensive to borrow money, which can cool down spending and hopefully bring inflation under control.
So on our graph, contractionary policy would shift the AD curve to the left.
That's right. But here's the catch. While that might help lower prices, it also risks decreasing output and increasing unemployment. It can create a larger output gap, which is the difference between the economy's actual output and its potential output.
Right, so it's another tough choice for policymakers. It seems like they're always facing these trade-offs no matter what they do.
They are. Macroeconomics is full of trade-offs.
It makes you wonder if there's any way to, like, predict how people are going to react to these policies.
Well, that's where the concept of expectations comes in. It plays a huge role in macroeconomics.
How so?
Well, think about it. If people expect inflation to be high, they might start demanding higher wages to keep up with the rising cost of living.
Right, that makes sense.
And if businesses expect inflation to be high, they might raise their prices in anticipation.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. Expectations can actually drive real economic outcomes. And that's why central banks pay so much attention to managing inflation expectations.
So it's not just about the actual policies they implement, it's also about how they communicate with the public.
Absolutely. A credible central bank, one that people trust, can really influence expectations. If they clearly communicate their inflation target and people believe they'll stick to it, it can actually help keep inflation under control.
So they're trying to steer the economy with words as much as with actual policy tools.
That's a great way to put it. And sometimes words can be just as powerful as actions.
Interesting. Are there any examples of this working in the real world?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The European Central Bank did this very successfully in the early 2000s. They were very transparent about their commitment to price stability, and it helped anchor inflation expectations and kept inflation in check.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. So we've been talking about supply shocks, things that hit the economy from the outside. But what happens when the problem comes from within the economy itself?
That's a great question, and it leads us to the concept of demand shocks.
Demand shocks. Okay. What are those?
It's basically a sudden change in the level of demand for goods and services in the economy.
Like what would cause that?
A common example is a sudden drop in consumer confidence. Let's say people get worried about losing their jobs, or there's a lot of uncertainty about the future. They start to tighten their belts, spend less, save more.
Right, because they want to be prepared in case things go south.
Exactly. And when everyone starts spending less, it can have a ripple effect throughout the entire economy. Businesses see their sales decline, they might start laying off workers, and it can create a downward spiral.
So instead of a ship getting hit by a wave, it's like the engine suddenly sputters and loses power.
Perfect analogy. And just like with supply shocks, demand shocks can shift that AD curve on our graph. In this case, because demand is decreasing, the AD curve shifts to the left.
Which means?
Well, it leads to lower output, potentially a recession, and of course, higher unemployment.
So what can policymakers do to address a demand shock? Is it the same as what they do for a supply shock?
The tools are similar, but the specific policies might differ depending on the nature of the shock and the overall state of the economy. But one common approach is, again, to use those expansionary fiscal or monetary policies we talked about earlier.
So basically try to stimulate demand and get that AD curve shifting back to the right.
Exactly. And there are plenty of real-world examples of this. Remember the 2008 financial crisis?
Oh yeah, that was a big one.
It was a classic example of a demand shock. Suddenly, credit markets froze up, banks were failing, businesses couldn't get loans, and consumer spending plummeted. It was a global crisis.
And how did governments respond?
Many governments around the world stepped in with stimulus spending. They cut taxes, increased spending on infrastructure projects, and tried to pump money back into the economy.
Kind of like giving the economy a financial jumpstart.
That's a good way to think about it. And it's important to remember that economics is rarely about finding the perfect solution.
It's more about finding the least bad option.
It's about weighing the options, considering the trade-offs, and trying to steer the economy in the right direction. Now, was the response to the 2008 crisis perfect? Probably not.
There were definitely some unintended consequences.
Right, there always are. But it likely helped prevent the recession from becoming even worse.
So it's a complex and messy process. But at least there are tools to try to manage these situations.
That's right. Now, before we wrap up, I think it's important to remember that there are different schools of thought in economics, different perspectives on how the economy works and the best way to manage it.
So it's not like there's one right answer to all these questions?
Nope. It's more like having different sets of navigational charts, each with its own approach to guiding the economic ship. And understanding these different perspectives can help us make more informed decisions.
That makes sense. So what are some of the main schools of thought we should be aware of?
Well, two of the biggest names in economics are John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman. They represent two very different views on how the economy works and the role of government in managing it. Think of it as a friendly rivalry between two brilliant minds.
A clash of the titans. Okay, I'm ready to learn more about these economic heavyweights.
Great. Let's start with Keynes. He was a British economist who rose to prominence during the Great Depression in the 1930s. So Keynes basically revolutionized the way we think about macroeconomics. Before Keynes, most economists believed that the economy was self-correcting. They thought that if there was a recession or a depression, the market would eventually fix itself.
Sort of like a pendulum swinging back and forth.
Yeah.
It might swing out wide, but it always comes back to the center.
Exactly. But Keynes, he challenged that view. He argued that the economy could get stuck in a rut, in a state of prolonged unemployment and low output. And he believed that government intervention was necessary to get things moving again.
Interesting. So what did he think was causing these economic ruts?
Well, he pointed to a few key factors, but one of the most important was something called sticky prices.
Sticky prices. What does that mean?
It means that prices don't always adjust quickly to changes in supply and demand.
Why not? Shouldn't prices go up when demand is high and down when demand is low?
In theory, yes, but in the real world, things aren't always that simple. Think about wages, for example. People don't get a raise or a pay cut every time the economy fluctuates, right?
No, most people have contracts or set salaries.
Exactly. So even if there's a sudden drop in demand, businesses might not be able to immediately lower wages to cut costs. They might be stuck with those higher wages for a while, and that's just one example. There are all sorts of prices that can be sticky for various reasons, like contracts, long-term agreements, or just plain old inertia.
I see. So if prices are sticky, they can't adjust quickly enough to bring the economy back into balance.
Exactly. And that's why Keynes argued that the economy could get stuck in a state of disequilibrium, with high unemployment and low output persisting for a long time.
Okay, so what was his solution to this problem?
Well, he believed that in these situations, the government needed to step in and actively manage demand. He advocated for things like government spending on public works projects, infrastructure improvements, or even just direct aid to households.
So basically putting more money into people's pockets so they can spend it and boost the economy.
Exactly. The idea is to stimulate demand and get the economy moving again, even if prices aren't adjusting as quickly as they should. Keynes argued that this kind of government intervention could help shorten recessions and get people back to work faster.
Interesting. So this is the foundation of what we now call Keynesian economics.
That's right. And it's had a huge influence on economic policymaking, especially in the decades following the Great Depression.
So Keynes believed in active government intervention to manage the economy. Now, what about Milton Friedman? How did his views differ?
Well, Friedman was a leading figure in what's known as the Chicago School of Economics. He was a strong advocate for free markets and limited government intervention. He believed that the government should play a much smaller role in the economy than Keynes did.
So he thought that the market could regulate itself without much government interference.
That was his basic philosophy. He argued that government intervention often does more harm than good. It can create distortions, inefficiencies, and even make economic problems worse.
Interesting. So how did Friedman explain those periods of economic downturn that Keynes was so worried about? Did he think they were just a natural part of the business cycle?
He did acknowledge that the economy goes through cycles of boom and bust, but he had a different view on what caused these fluctuations and what role the government should play in addressing them.
Okay, so what was his take on it?
Well, one of the key concepts in Friedman's thinking is the idea of rational expectations.
Rational expectation. Okay, what does that mean?
It means that people are generally pretty good at anticipating what's going to happen in the economy and making decisions accordingly.
So they're not just blindly reacting to events, they're actually thinking ahead and planning for the future.
Exactly. And Friedman argued that this rational behavior on the part of individuals and businesses actually helps to stabilize the economy.
Interesting. So how does that play out in practice?
Well, let's say the government announces a big increase in spending to try to stimulate the economy. Keynesians might argue that this will boost demand and lead to more economic activity.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
But Friedman would say, hold on a second. If people are rational, they'll realize that this increase in government spending will eventually have to be paid for through higher taxes or inflation.
So they might actually save more now in anticipation of those future costs.
Exactly. So instead of boosting demand, the government spending might actually have a much smaller effect than intended because people are adjusting their behavior based on their rational expectations.
I see. So Friedman's view is that government intervention can sometimes backfire if it doesn't take into account how people will react to it.
That's a big part of his argument. He believed that the government should focus on creating stable and predictable conditions for the economy. Things like a stable monetary policy and low taxes, and then just get out of the way and let the market do its thing.
Okay, I think I'm starting to grasp the difference between these two schools of thought. Keynesians are more interventionist. They believe the government has an active role to play in managing the economy.
Right.
And neoclassicals, following Friedman's ideas, are more hands-off. They think the market can generally regulate itself, and government intervention often does more harm than good.
That's a great summary. Now, it's important to remember that these are just two of the many schools of thought in economics.
Right.
And there are lots of variations and nuances within each school. But the Keynesian neoclassical debate is one of the most fundamental and enduring in economics.
And it continues to shape policy debates today. Okay, so we've got these two big camps with different views on how the economy works and how to manage it. But they both agree that the economy goes through cycles of boom and bust, right?
Oh yeah, the business cycle is a fundamental concept in macroeconomics.
Right. But even here, there are different perspectives on what exactly drives these fluctuations.
Exactly. Some economists have a more deterministic view of the business cycle. They believe that economic ups and downs follow a predictable pattern, like maybe it's tied to investment cycles or technological innovation.
So it's like a regular heartbeat.
Oh.
Boom and bust, on a fairly predictable schedule.
That's one way to think about it. But other economists, especially those influenced by early 20th century thinkers like Slutsky and Frisch, take a more stochastic view.
Stochastic. That sounds a bit complicated. What does that mean?
It basically means random. They see the economy as being constantly bombarded by random shocks that can throw things off course.
So it's less like a heartbeat and more like driving down a bumpy road. You never know when you're going to hit a pothole.
That's a great analogy. These shocks could be anything from a natural disaster to a political crisis to a sudden change in consumer tastes.
Right, so lots of unpredictable factors can impact the economy.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why managing the economy is so difficult. You can't always predict what's going to happen next. You have to be prepared to adapt and adjust on the fly.
Makes sense. Now, one thing that makes economic management even more challenging is something called policy lags, right? Our grade guru summary mentioned this.
Oh yeah, policy lags are a huge headache for policymakers. They can really make things tricky.
So remind me, what are they again?
Basically, it's the time it takes for a policy change to actually have an effect on the economy. There are several types of lags. There's the recognition lag, which is the time it takes for policymakers to realize that there's a problem in the first place.
Right, because economic data isn't always up to the minute.
Exactly. Then there's the decision lag, which is the time it takes to decide what to do about the problem.
Which I imagine can involve lots of debate and analysis.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Then there's the implementation lag, which is the time it takes to actually put the policy into action.
So even once you've made a decision, it might take a while to actually get things rolling.
Right. And finally, there's the effectiveness lag, which is the time it takes for the policy to actually have its intended effect on the economy.
Wow, so it's like a whole chain of delays. I could see how that would complicate things. It's like trying to steer a ship where the steering wheel is connected to the rudder with a really long, stretchy rope.
That's a great analogy. You're turning the wheel, but it takes a while for the ship to actually respond. And in economics, those delays can be really significant. We're talking months, sometimes even years.
So by the time a policy takes effect, the situation might have already changed completely.
That's the danger, and that's one reason why economists like Milton Friedman were so skeptical of government intervention.
Right, because he believed in limited government involvement. So what was his take on policy lags?
He argued that these lags make it extremely difficult to fine-tune the economy. You're always trying to hit a moving target, and you might end up making things worse instead of better.
So what did he suggest as an alternative?
He advocated for more stable and predictable policies, like a steady rate of money supply growth, rather than trying to constantly react to every little bump in the road. He believed that creating a stable macroeconomic environment would allow businesses and individuals to make better long-term decisions and ultimately lead to a healthier economy.
So it's more about setting the stage for a good performance than trying to control every note of the music.
Exactly. Now, even Friedman acknowledged that there might be times when government intervention is necessary, like in a severe recession or a financial crisis. But he believed those interventions should be limited and targeted, and the government should get out of the way as soon as possible.
Okay, so it's not an all or nothing approach. There's room for nuance.
Yeah.
It depends on the specific situation.
Exactly. Now, another factor that adds a whole other layer of complexity to this is politics.
Right, because economic decisions are rarely made in a vacuum. Politicians have their own agendas and incentives, and that can sometimes clash with what's best for the economy.
Absolutely. And that brings us to an interesting concept called political business cycles.
Okay, let's dive into that. I'm intrigued.
Okay.
So, political business cycles. This sounds juicy. Tell me more.
Well, it's basically the idea that politicians might try to manipulate the economy for their own political gain, even if it's not in the best long-term interest of the country.
Oh, that's cynical. So they're putting their own careers ahead of the well-being of the economy.
Well, it's not always that blatant or intentional, but the incentives are definitely there. Think about it. Politicians want to get reelected, right?
Of course.
And a strong economy is good for their chances of reelection. So they might be tempted to implement policies that will boost the economy in the short term, even if those policies have negative consequences down the road.
So it's like throwing a big party to win votes, even if you can't really afford it.
That's a good analogy, and there are a couple of main ways this can play out. One is through something called electoral business cycles.
Electoral business cycles. Okay.
The idea here is that incumbent politicians might try to stimulate the economy right before an election to boost their chances of winning. They might cut taxes or increase spending to create a temporary economic boom, even if it leads to inflation or a budget deficit later on.
I see. So they're trying to time the economic cycle to their advantage.
Exactly. Now, whether this actually happens in practice is a matter of debate among economists. Some studies have found evidence of electoral cycles, but others haven't. It's a tough thing to prove definitively because there are so many other factors that can influence the economy.
Right. It's not like you can run a controlled experiment with the whole country. Okay, so electoral cycles are one way politics can influence the economy. What about partisan business cycles?
Ah, yes, those are interesting too. The idea with partisan business cycles is that different political parties have different economic priorities.
Right. Like some are more focused on keeping inflation low, while others are more concerned with promoting economic growth.
Exactly. So as these parties alternate in power, you might see the economy bouncing back and forth between periods of high growth and low inflation and periods of low growth and high inflation, depending on which party is in control.
So it's like a tug of war, with each party pulling the economy in a different direction. Do we know if this actually happens?
Again, it's tough to say for sure. There's some evidence that suggests it might be a factor, but the economy is such a complex system that it's hard to isolate the effects of political ideology from all the other things that are going on.
Right. It's not like you can just point to one thing and say, aha, that's the partisan business cycle at work.
Nope. Economics is messy like that. There are always multiple factors at play.
So many variables. Okay. Well, our Grey Guru summary mentioned one more concept that I'd love to get your take on, the median voter theorem.
Ah, yes, the median voter theorem. That's a classic. It's a political science theory that has some interesting implications for economics.
Lay it on me.
Okay, so the basic idea is that in a two-party system, both parties will tend to gravitate toward the center of the political spectrum in order to appeal to the median voter.
The median voter being like the average person right in the middle of the ideological spectrum.
Exactly. The idea is that this voter represents the swing vote, the one who can tip the scales in an election. So both parties will try to tailor their policies to appeal to this voter, even if it means compromising some of their core beliefs.
Interesting. So even if the parties have different economic philosophies, they might end up with policies that are more similar than different because they're both trying to win over the same voters?
That's the idea. And if that's true, it could actually moderate some of those political business cycles we were talking about. Instead of those sharp swings in policy, you might see more gradual adjustments as both parties try to stay close to the center.
So it's like a kind of centripetal force pulling everything towards the middle.
That's a good way to put it. Of course, in the real world, things are never quite that neat and tidy. Politics is messy. But the median voter theorem provides a useful framework for thinking about how political incentives can shape economic policymaking.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to an already complex topic. Well, I'd
Yeah.
say we've covered a lot of ground today. We dove deep into demand management policies, explored different schools of thought, and even ventured into the sometimes murky world of politics and economics.
It's been a whirlwind tour of Macroeconomics 101.
It really has. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that economics isn't just about graphs and equations. It's about real people making decisions in a complex, dynamic world, and those decisions have real consequences.
Absolutely. And understanding the forces that drive the economy can help us make better decisions, both as individuals and as a society.
Well said. So to our listeners out there, as you go about your day, keep those economic gears turning. Think about the things we discussed today, and remember that economics is all around us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into macroeconomics. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.